sequel to the panel this evening is this evening's workshop, Science Fiction and Direct Action Training. And that'll be in the MU Journey Room, starting at 6 p.m. I'm Tony Vogt. I teach in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. I'd like to thank the school for generous support that made possible today's events, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Inaris Project for Alternative Futures. The Inaris Project is responsible for bringing together today's panel and workshop. I'd also like to thank Bob Pecknow, who is making it possible for people who can't be here today to watch the video at their leisure later on. Along with my friend and colleague, Joseph Orozco, I'm one of the co-founders of the Inaris Project. The project was inspired by the speculative fiction of Oregon writer Ursula K. Le Guin. Inaris is the ambiguous utopia in her novel, The Dispossessed. We envision the project as a forum for conversations, ideas, and initiatives that promote a future free of domination, exploitation, oppression, war, and empire. We see ourselves as a small part of the global nurturing and development of the radical imagination. The project's based on the understanding that past, present, and future are not separate. We initiate events that help promote the living futures constantly coming into being in the present. Those innovations and creative insurgencies happening everywhere in our midst. We bring together activists and scholars from the arts, humanities, social and natural sciences who are writing, thinking, and teaching about the themes explored in Le Guin's work: gender, racial, and sexual justice, ecological sustainability, left libertarian anarchist traditions, utopias and dystopias, alternatives to war, and cooperative economic arrangements. You can search the Inaris Project online and find our website. Check it out. So please welcome the co-founder of the Inaris Project, Joseph Orozco, who will introduce today's inspiring speakers.
So I just want to say thank you to you all for being here and sharing your time this afternoon on this lovely Oregon afternoon to be here to talk about science fiction, social justice, and the radical imagination. As Tony shared, this is part of a two-part activity for today. We're here to talk about this new collection that's come out, Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements, edited by one of our speakers today. And it's a fantastic collection that just came out from AK Press, trying to think about how to use speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy fiction, to think about social transformation towards a more just and peaceful world. And in that spirit, we're very thankful, first off, to Special Collections here, and I want to recognize Ann Beatty for allowing us to be in the Special Collections Center here, where Linus Pauling's papers are stored. Linus Pauling, of course, Oregon native who won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one in peace. And what we have here actually is a collection of his personal science fiction literature. So he, in the 1960s, was a big fan of pulp science fiction magazines and novels. Feel free to come and browse and take a look at some of the things that Pauling collected. And Linus Pauling admitted in interviews while he was alive that science fiction literature was very important for him as a young person in terms of helping him to nourish his imagination, to think about alternative worlds. And as a scientist, he continued to collect magazines and read these stories. And he admitted that at a certain point, he himself thought about becoming a science fiction author. And he sort of sketched out ideas about space travel and what it would mean to have these different, what it would mean for human beings to have different forms of DNA configurations based on the sorts of kinds of research that he was doing at the time. And so he saw science fiction as a way to sort of exercise his mind, his imagination, and ways to help him sort of think about and work out in his own mind the problems that were part of his science fiction. And I think it's very appropriate that we can be here today to share with our two guests today this idea of thinking about this particular form of literature for the purposes of changing society towards new futures, ones that hopefully can be more just and peaceful and better worlds in general for ourselves. So I want to thank once again Anne and Archives for being able to house us today. Please note, of course, like I said, as Tony indicated, that we do have a second session this evening at 6 p.m. in the MU Journey Room. There'll be a short little break here. That will be an activist training that one of our speakers has been doing across the nation, trying to spread the gospel of Octavius Brood and trying to train a new generation of social justice activists sort of steeped in the traditions, not only of the science fiction writer Octavia Butler, but of thinking about this literature in a new and innovative way. So I don't want to take up much more time. I want to introduce our two speakers for today for the panel. The first is someone that many of you probably already know here on campus. She has been to Corvallis many, many times. She is, in fact, on faculty here at OSU in women's gender and sexuality studies. She also teaches at PSU, does women's history, African American movement history at PSU. Right, this is Walida Imarisha. She, a couple of years ago, was the OSU Distinguished Speaker for our MLK celebration, and earlier this year she was the featured speaker for the City of Corvallis MLK celebration. She has been going around the country talking about this work. She is an amazing activist, amazing organizer, a poet, a science fiction writer in her own right. She has a great story in this collection herself. You will undoubtedly be wowed by her geekdom, and you can ask her to speak to you in Klingon. I was telling my students today in class, you should come check this out, because this woman is amazing, and she can even out-geek me, because I don't know anything about Klingon, and she can speak this thing. My students were like, no one can out-geek you. Walida Imarisha is here today with us, and we also are going to be sharing some time with one of the contributors to this, Gabriel Theodros. I believe that this, I'm not sure if is this your first science fiction story?
It's been published.
Right, so this collection contains some of his first published science fiction work. Gabriel is a musician originally from Seattle, Washington, has issued several albums on his own, is a well-known DJ MC in Portland, right? And so we are really quite honored to have both of them here to share with us Octavia's Brood. So please help me to welcome Walida and Gabriel.
Thank you all so much. Thanks so much to Joseph and Tony and the Inaris Project. I love getting to say the Inaris Project. Do you guys know I'm going to speak with the Inaris Project? Yes, Ursula Gwynn! So we're very excited to be here. I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of the project and the history of it, and then we'll both read an excerpt from our stories, and then we'd love to have some time to have some conversation with y'all before we head over and do some sci-fi and direct action organizing workshops. So hopefully folks can make it to that, because it's kind of the funnest workshop ever. So Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements, is a collection I co-edited with my co-editor Adrienne Marie Brown, who lives in Detroit. And it includes 20 stories that are written by folks who are community organizers, social activists, folks involved in changing and reimagining the world every single day. We also have 2 essays, one of them by Tanana Radu, who is an amazing Black horror writer, and she's writing about Octavia Butler, who the collection is named for. I'll put more about her in a minute. Tanana Radu is writing about Octavia Butler and social change. And then we have an essay from Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is a political prisoner, a journalist, an incredible freedom fighter, and a big nerd. If y'all didn't know, now you know. And he wrote an amazing essay about Star Wars and imperialism, which we will actually get to hear because he was generous enough to record an audio commentary, so he can be coming into this space with us. But that's the collection itself, and when you asked Gabe, many of the writers had never written fiction, and certainly not science fiction before, the majority of the writers. But that was our goal, because I think I'm just going to stand because this is going to be awkward. I'm like Vanna Whiting it for myself. Because we believe that actually all organizing is science fiction. And so we think that organizers are the Every time we try to imagine a world without prisons, a world without borders, a world without capitalism, a world without police violence, that's science fiction, right? That doesn't exist. But being able to collectively imagine it means that we can begin to pull it out of this sort of dream world and into reality. And so we think that, organizers are holding this every day as sci-fi creators. And conversely, we think that movements for social change absolutely need science fiction. Because science fiction is really one of the only genres that not only allows you to throw out everything you thought you knew was real and possible, but it actually demands that you throw that out and beginning from asking the question, what's a realistic win? Which many of our movements for social change start there, right? What can we realistically win? And actually, it forces you to ask the question, what is the world we want to live in, right? So not restricting our dreams before they even begin to get dreamt. And so we have created some principles, right? Because, we say science fiction, but there are a lot of big blockbuster science fiction films out there, and they are not all necessarily helpful for us to build a new just world, unless as a cautionary tale, right? And so, so we wanted to come up with a term that differentiated this from that sort of, mainstream, one white, straight, cis dude who saves the entire world from everything by blowing up everything, and that's how we know we won. Everything's blowing up. And we're, the rest of us are just in the corner like, I hope he doesn't. So no to that. We don't want that. So we came up with the term visionary fiction. We also came up with the term visionary fiction because we didn't want to argue with our nerd folks about, it's technically not science fiction. There's not enough scientific basis for that. It's really more speculative fiction, maybe a little magical realism in there. I go with alternative timelines, but not science fiction. I love you all so much. I cannot have this conversation with you. So visionary fiction is just a bucket that all of that goes into. Basically, if it's weird and it helps us build new just worlds, that's us, right? That could be our tagline. So we came up with some principles for visionary fiction, and there's an update that's available. In case you're wondering, just so you know. These are the principles of visionary fiction. We can talk more about that, and we can talk about how we feel like it manifests in our stories. But that it explores current social issues through the lens of science fiction and speculative fiction, magical realism, fantasy, and really all art explores social issues, right? Because these fantastical worlds are built out of the bones of this world, right? But we are conscious that that's what we're doing. It's conscious of identity and intersecting identities. It's really about centering those folks who have been marginalized, right? So again, it's not the one straight white cis dude and then his token crew, right? Where there's the black guy, and that's all he is. He's a black guy, and he really loves that white guy, and he's gonna die for him. He's gonna die for him, right? Or there's the white woman who is just pretty. She's just real pretty, and that's all she can do. She's like, oh, I'm so tired from being pretty. So not that. We don't want that. So really centering those folks who have been marginalized and recognizing that when we do, we actually shift the entire way that we see social justice happening and the future happening. It's conscious of power inequalities. This piece is really important. We've actually gotten a lot of questions around, well, are we writing utopian fiction? And we can talk more about what that means. But the short answer is no. We actually don't think there is such a thing as a utopia, and that it's not actually very helpful. Because as long as there's a human being there, it's going to be messy. Right? It's not going to be a utopia. It's messy. But we also think there's no such thing as a true dystopia. Because as long as there's one human being who can hope for a different future, it's not a true dystopia, right? And so we think that visionary fiction is realistic and hard, but ultimately hopeful. It's hopeful that change can happen. It's hopeful that new just worlds can be built. As long as we're holding these principles, and especially that the change is coming from the bottom up, not the top down, that it's very much a decentralized kind of power structure that's happening, not, this is what we're going to do, says the president, but the community coming together and saying what is best for us. So change is collective. And lastly, visionary fiction is not neutral. We don't purport to be neutral. Our goal is social change. It's to write incredible, engaging, quality literature that will change this world and every other one that we go to visit. So, it's just like a small goal, not even a big one. And so why we called it Octavia's Brood is because we think that Octavia Butler was a black female science fiction writer who won the MacArthur Genius Grant, and unfortunately passed away in 2006 in Seattle, where she was living. We think that Octavia Butler's work encapsulates all of these principles and values amazingly, that she really was one of those writers who showed us how to do that. And if you've read any of her work, it's definitely realistic and hard, right? If you read Parable of the Sower, I was like, whoo, I need a nap. This world is rough, it's rough, but at the end, again, it's hopeful that change can happen. And if you haven't read Octavia Butler, obviously I can give you homework, but you should read her. For fun, not homework, fun work. So these are the stories that came out of that idea of visionary fiction. This is our collection, and you're going to hear from two stories, but Adrian and I really tried to have a variety of stories, and I think that there are no two stories that are alike in the collection. I feel like they are all very individual in tone, in content, in the ways that it explores and the issues it explores. And so, I'm going to brag a little bit because I'm up here and you're looking at me. If you notice LeVar Burton's name is there. So many people don't know that LeVar Burton, from reading Rainbow, Star Trek: The Next Generation, Roots, that he wrote a science fiction book called Aftermath, which is amazing, and everyone needs to read it. And so he was more than generous enough to let us include an excerpt from that book in that. So I want to move into bringing the voices into the room, and I really wanted to start with Mumia. I think two of the ways that we're really trying to engage with this idea of sci-fi and social change is one that you'll hear momentarily from our stories of really writing new just worlds, or writing these stories, our own narratives, our own mythologies that can help us build those new just worlds. And the other side that I think that Mumia does incredibly well, and that we're going to do actually in the workshop, is deconstructing existing science fiction worlds and saying, what are the messages being sent in here? How do we analyze this? And how can we subvert this, right? As was told, I've invested a lot of my time in Star Trek, y'all. I learned Klingonese. It's real. So I don't want to just throw that out. So how do we subvert these franchises that many of us have spent perhaps a little too much time investing in to really, have them be able to speak to our core values. And I just want to just be clear, if folks haven't heard, Mumia is actually really gravely ill right now. He's been hospitalized. He's been in the infirmary in the prison. He actually was just moved back to a hospital. He lost 80 pounds in a matter of a couple months. He can't stand on his own. He's in a wheelchair. And right now they're refusing to do tests for cancer on him, even though the symptoms seem pretty clear. And so there's a campaign on to get folks to put pressure on to get Mumia to see his own doctor, and to get those diagnostic tests and to make sure that they're followed up on. So if folks are interested, you can go to freemumia.com, and there's more information about ways to support.
When Star Wars premiered in 1977, it swept the nation like a fever. Lines circled blocks, and before long it was more than a movie, it was a craze. TV commercials hawked wares and late with Star Wars figures, available from the guns and yours now. Before all was said and done, the movie grossed nearly $500 million itself as it wanted to be, as it claimed to be in its infancy against a cruel and despotic king of the late 18th century. It reshaped itself into the rebels, not the imperial overlords. It shaped itself as oppressed, fighting for freedom. But America, like every nation, has its ages of psychosis. It has fits of indecision and periods of self-delusion. Consider how American presidents spoke movingly of freedom from tyranny while holding personally hundreds of men, women, and children in slavery. Or imagine Jefferson, the sage of Monticello, who was the father of half black children, at the same moment as he wrote in his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, that black people were essentially non-human, a species related to the orangutan. I mean, does this mean that he saw himself as being in the bestiality? Or did this mean he really thought his children were, well, half monkey? Americans, like any people, are subject to delusions. Was this fascination with Star Wars and the national identification with the rebels one of them? For generations, Americans have declined to define themselves as imperialists. That's what our parents called us. That wasn't what we called ourselves. We were for freedom. We were for self-determination. We were good. We were white, mostly. We were Luke Skywalker, not Darth Vader, and definitely not the cruel, warped emperor. Yet aficionados of the Star Wars saga know that Luke and Darth were, after all, intimately related. Darth's infamous line and their lightsaber battle has become a cultural byword. I am your father, Luke. It is a measure of Lucas's genius that he scripts that moment of self-realization, of self-discovery, and of revelation. In the grisly aftermath of a war that tore millions from the face of Asia, all to cover for the corporate exploitation of Vietnam's bauxite and other natural resources, the imperial shock trooper, the imperial metallic death man, was father to the rebel. They were, in fact, more than related. In truth, they were one. That is the meaning of Star Wars. We were rebels. We are empire. And like all rebellious children, we were going through a phase. We're getting ready for adulthood after we sowed a few wild oats. Once grown, we put on our imperial uniform and bow to the empire. It is your destiny, right? Unless, from somewhere, maybe on the Enterprise, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
He does the voice, y'all. I was listening to the audio on my computer and I was like answering. I was like, oh my god, I almost fell off my chair when I heard you do the voice. That was amazing. So I would love to turn it over to one of my best friends and one of the amazing contributors to Octavia's Brood, Gabriel Teodros, who wrote the story La Novella. And he can talk a little bit about his journey and then read an excerpt from it.
Yeah, thank you. So, hi, Gabriel. I live in Seattle, Washington, just to clear that up. I'm not from Portland.
You want to play where?
No offense. It's nothing personal. Yeah, so 5 years ago, Waleed and Adrian put out the call to some of us to write a story for Octavia's Brood. And just in the framing of Octavia's Brood, which largely was the presentation that you just watched of visionary fiction, it immediately, it changed the way I thought, and it changed the way I approached my work ever since. Just as, somebody that's an activist, a child of activists, somebody whose family is from Ethiopia, and it made me look at everything I was doing as like, am I being completely reactive to things that are thrown my way, or is there a part of this that is also generative, imaginative? How am I spending my energy in working to build the worlds I want to see instead of always only reacting? So it was like a light switch, like my life was changed, and also it helped me look at just years and years of nerding out in science fiction as something that wasn't just for fun. Like, this is also a useful tool, you know? So the first thing I wrote was not a story though. The first thing that I did was, because I'm a musician first and foremost, I was in the studio with my cousin Khalid Hidero and another MC producer named Burnt Face. And the three of us are all, you know, we all have roots in Ethiopia. And we're doing a song. And we knew that we just wanted to do something different than anything that we had done before. And Lolita had just sent me the email about Octavia's Brood. And I said, let's do a sci-fi song. And I came up with a character in the moment that was based on my real life, but completely in a metaphorical sense. So my character in Copper Wire, and the song turned into a whole album, and we ended up like touring Ethiopia, touring the country, and I have copies of the CD here. Nettie Okorafor wrote the liner notes. It's crazy.
And it's amazing. Like, it's like hip hop, like space opera, sun ra, Ethiopian, visionary, next level-ish, y'all. Like,
The idea was making a transmedia storytelling project out of the album. My character, though, his name is Gitazia 13 Zeratoicus Oxygen, and he's half human, half alien, born and raised on a space station, and he's coming to Earth for the first time throughout the course of the album to learn what it means to be human. The metaphor being based on my life as being half Ethiopian, half, you know, Scottish, Irish, Native American, grown up in Seattle, Washington. And in the course of making the album, we actually went to Ethiopia for the first time in my life. And I'm learning about what that means, right? So that links to Ethiopia, which is where a lot of my writing comes from. And particularly, my story in Octavia's Brood is called Lalibela. I just want to talk a little bit about Ethiopia, because to me, like, what happened in just my mother's lifetime in Ethiopia, it really like exemplifies to me like what Octavia's Brood is about, and what happens when you don't imagine a different future. Because there was 3 different complete government changes. There was a popular revolution where the people won in my mom's lifetime, and she was like in her early 20s. And the government that replaced the one before was more oppressive than the one that became before it. And then there was another revolution like years later. And to me, Ethiopia, like in the state that the country is right now, is a model. Like it shows me and proves to me that change is inevitable, that you can win any fight that you're involved in. You know, you can and will. But if you don't imagine the world that you want to see after you win that fight, a lot of times we become the monsters that we're fighting against because we never imagined a world without it, right? So that thought was with me heavy when I wrote this story, and it's a speculative history story where I went into I had to do a lot of research to write this story. So it's based on a place. The place is called Lalibela, and there's 11 monolithic structures in Lalibela. The most famous one is in that picture. It's called the Temple of St. Georgis. It is 3 stories tall, and it's carved out of a single rock into the side of the mountain. Every part of it is completely symmetrical, and it's a mystery to the world how that structure was built. To this day, no one knows. There's a lot of different speculation, and there's also like a lot of a lot of religious history and like the popular story that they tell about how Lalibela was built. If you ask a lot of Ethiopians, they say that angels came and built it at night, right? So I looked at that story, and I looked at other parts of Ethiopian culture and said, what happens if you take the religion out of it and put people in the place of that, and people power? And also, like, when I look at, there's another picture I was looking at when I started writing this story where it's Lalibela at night, and the stars are really bright, and it's kind of from the hillside, and that joint just looks like a spaceport. So I said, what if it's a spaceport? And then there's Lalibela crosses that a lot of people in Ethiopia wear, which don't look like crucifixes, like they're not like this, but they're more like, they resemble ankhs. Some of them look like fractal patterns, and there's like 200 different variations. I said, what if those are time traveling devices? And instead of crosses. So that's the genesis of my story. Now I'm going to read the excerpt. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, present day. The key was hidden in plain sight, in twisted metal and shapes within shapes, in fractals and complex geometric patterns people just accepted as religious symbolism. They called it a cross, but it was no crucifix. The truth was buried generations deep and kept there by nothing but a common belief. Most people wore a variation of it around their neck. Some had it sewn into fabric, like the history of all humanity. It was buried in Ethiopia under nothing but a thin layer of dust. His appearance started as a tiny piece of metal that appeared in the rubble on the side of the road. Insignificant, barely noticeable. The metal multiplied itself and then multiplied itself again, growing in the same pattern of what people would then recognize as a mesquite. Soon, it stood upright, and it grew taller and taller as the light bled through every opening in the pattern. When it was tall enough for him to pass through, an old man appeared from the light holding onto the cross. When he was fully present, the light was gone. He seemed out of time, wearing all white the way a monk would. Cars sped by, people walked past, and donkeys carrying wood moved about, seemingly oblivious to a human that had just appeared out of thin air. "You can't expect us to wait forever," a young man yelled at the elder in the overcrowded Addis Ababa traffic. "Move on and get out of my way." Gebri Meskel Lalibela has had quite the journey and was understandably shaken up. In his time, Ethiopian technology allowed his people to build computers, teleportation devices, starships, and even a spaceport in the highlands of Roha. There, people lived in buildings on top of buildings that were all carved from a single rock. There were many people he loved whom he had to say goodbye to as they went on trips to distant galaxies, knowing he may never see them again. Yet nothing he had seen then compared to the chaos surrounding him now. In this new capital of the country he had ruled over 800 years earlier, what he saw made him wish that time machines had never been invented. The air now smelled like black pepper, and the sky was covered by smoke that didn't move, making it hard for him to breathe. The streets were crowded with vehicles that coughed up this poison, and with people and animals, and he couldn't see how they all fit together. There were huge palaces, and there were people crawling and even sleeping on the busy street. He leaned on the cross like it was the only thing holding him up, and he thought, how have we become so close and so distant at the exact same time?
So I'm going to read an excerpt of my piece, and it's called Black Angel. I have a little slide. Here's one. It's not bloopers anymore, though. That's a little slide, so, don't look at that part.
That was part of the time.
Yeah, it's the longer piece. But it's fine. So I created I was always into comic books, and I created, but many of the superheroes didn't look anything like me, and didn't fight for the just worlds that I wanted, right? I mean, Batman, but he's just rich. He's just a rich white dude, and he gets to enact his idea of justice on everyone. I was like, so this isn't fiction, y'all. And the world he makes, that's not the world I want. I'm like, I want to live in Gotham City. So I created my own superhero, who is a grumpy, big-haired, fallen black angel who was kicked out of heaven by God for trying to stop a genocide from happening. And he was like, I have a plan. And she was like, your plan kind of sucks. And he was like, you got to go. And her name is A, because they didn't have names in heaven, so she's like, whatever, A, that's fine. A shook her head to clear it as she continued her nightly wanderings through a dark city. She looked up and realized she had walked much further than she usually did. The black neighborhood of Harlem had blended into an immigrant one with bodega signs in at least 3 different languages, ads for international calling cards plastered on every surface. Just as she started to think about turning back, she heard a huge tumult, like 1,000 hearts being ripped apart at once. Screams. No matter what language, she knew the sound of desperate prayers hurtled toward an impassive sky. Without thinking, A sprinted towards the noise. She turned the corner to see pure horror. People poured out of a tenement building like a river of tears. Families, children, elders, all immigrant. They were shoved, driven, beaten by men in bulletproof vests carrying automatic weapons, the kind usually reserved for military warfare. The stomp of boots like bombshells exploding. A line of industrial-sized trucks, each branded Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE. Windows of the trucks like angry slitted eyes on a face full of rage. The truck's engines growled, doors bared like teeth. The agents threw people on top of each other into the trucks until they were full, then started on the next. Bodies packed in, shackled together for the forced passage south to the border. Weeks choking on stagnant air. Darkness, cries, gasps dying on lips. A had heard about this. Once it had made its arrest quota set for it by Congress, ICE had no use for the undocumented immigrants it snared. Since the economy had bottomed out, all new prison construction ceased as politicians tried to do triage on the budget. What prisons there were already overflowing with bodies, too often black and brown. But the ingenious and insidious waste not, want not ideology of the system kicked in. After scanning everyone, ICE loaded them into trucks and drove them just across the Mexican border. They sold other humans to the U.S. corporations' giant factories a stone's throw away. The corporations bought these workers by the truckload. Most didn't last a year, toiling in the unventilated 100-degree-plus heat. A's heart sank. This was the embodiment of the evil humans do to one another. Even animals don't turn on each other unless they have to. Humans do it at a drop of a hat, the slip of a dollar. She shook her head, disgusted. ICE must have been at this a while because there were only 24 or so folks left. How many hours has it taken them to clear this building of hundreds, A thought desperately. Why hasn't anyone done something? What about all these people in these surrounding buildings? Why haven't they called for the authorities? A reflection of light caught her eye, the luminescence of streetlight bouncing off the badge of a New York cop. Courtesy, professionalism, respect, the NYPD's motto. The authorities were already here, watching ICE round up people and send them to their deaths. No one was coming to help. Just then, out of the corner of A's eye, she saw a group of people emerge from the tumult in a ragged arrowhead formation. They charged the NYPD's perimeter line. As they moved, A could see children protected in the middle, all under the age of 10. One little girl stared back at A. Her smallness emphasized her large eyes, brimming with fear. The arrowhead of immigrant bodies hit the police line, which gave a little but did not break. The formation backed up slightly, then plowed forward quickly before the officers could draw their guns. This time, a fissure opened up as two cops were shoved apart. The men and women grappled with the police, fighting with all their might. It all happened in less than a minute. What are they going to do, A wondered. The hole wasn't big enough for them to get through, and it would close up soon. Look, the cops were already adjusting. It wasn't until she saw the quick movements on the other side of the line that it dawned on her. The children. The adults never intended to get out. They broke open enough space for their children to escape. The small bodies poured through now, running swiftly and disappearing into the night before ICE and the NYPD even knew they were gone. A had seen so many horrific scenes since she had been cast out, so much violence and hatred and ugliness. She'd almost forgotten what else she saw when she gazed down from heaven. Self-sacrifice, immense acts of love, bravery beyond words, like now. A's attention was drawn back to the formation, which had by this time disintegrated. One of the children hadn't made it through, the little girl with the big eyes. She clung to the leg of one of the women fighting. A assumed it was her mother. By this time, agents from the other side ran over. They could not fire into the crowd without risking hitting their fellow officers. So they pulled out batons and began smashing people from all sides. There was no escape, just the sickening impact of wood on tender flesh, on bones. A's stomach tightened. There will always be those humans so twisted, so hungry from power they will devour all in their way, even the weak, the children. But she also thought, not all of them. There will also always be those who fight back, who push the forces of destruction away. A thought of the time since her expulsion that she had walked past a mugging, a beating, Times she had heard screams through the walls, seen fresh blood in the stairway, heard whimpers in the dark, and done nothing. And for the first time, she was ashamed of herself. No, she shook her head, that's not true. She had been ashamed of herself since the first time she let her fear of pain, of having something else taken from her, stop her from doing what she knew was right. This was just the first time she had allowed herself to admit it. When A was in heaven, she was an angel of mercy, never an angel of vengeance. Never wielded a fiery sword and wrought terror on those who had done wrong. But no one who saw her this day would have ever guessed that. She threw off her trench coat like a dark storm cloud and unleashed her remaining black wing. It unfurled until it blotted out the glow of the streetlights. Her face twisted almost beyond recognition with rage, and she was more terrible than anyone could ever imagine. Her wings sliced through 2 agents in front of her as she ran toward the trucks. Angels of vengeance have steel for wings, and her remaining wing had become razor sharp. She could not tell if the agents she hit were alive or dead. She did not care.